In 1945, Germany was not a country. It was a crime scene with a flag, cities reduced to rubble, a third of its industry gone, food output cut in half, and people surviving on roughly 1,000 calories a day, less than half of what a grown adult needs to function. Most economists at the time looked at what was left of Germany and reached the same conclusion. This nation is finished. Whatever comes next will take generations, if it comes at all. 3 years later, shopkeepers pulled hoarded goods out of their back rooms overnight, and within a decade, the country was being called an economic miracle. Then, less than 50 years after that, the same country nearly collapsed again, this time from the inside, absorbing a bill so large it earned a new nickname, the sick man of Europe. And now, right now, in 2026, Germany is facing a third crisis, one that some of its own economists are calling structurally different from anything the country has survived before. So here's the question worth sitting with for the next few minutes. How does a country come back from total ruin? Not once, but twice? What actually saved it each time versus what people simply assumed saved it? And is the crisis happening in Germany right now the kind of thing this country has proven it can survive? Or is this genuinely different? This is EndGame analysis. Let's walk through all three collapses and all three so-called miracles using what actually happened. Not the version of the story that gets repeated because it's more comfortable to believe. By the time World War II ended, Germany's economy wasn't struggling, it had essentially stopped existing. Industrial production had fallen by more than a third. 20% of the country's housing stock was rubble. Food production sat at roughly half of pre-war levels. Cologne, once home to 750,000 people, had a population of around 32,000. The country was carved into 4 occupation zones by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and roughly half of all transactions happening anywhere in the country were happening on the black market, with cigarettes functioning as a more trusted currency than actual German money. Here's the detail that gets lost in the miracle framing. For the first 3 years after the war, nothing got better. The Allies initially kept most of Hitler's old price controls in place, assuming that was the responsible way to manage a broken economy. It didn't work. Shelves stayed empty, production stayed stalled, rationing continued. If you were a German civilian in 1946 or 1947, there was no visible sign that recovery was coming. You were 3 years into peace and still living on wartime rations, sometimes worse than wartime rations. Then, on June 20th, 1948, a German economist named Ludwig Erhard did something that terrified almost everyone around him. He replaced the old worthless Reichsmark with a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, and on the very same day, he abolished the price controls the Allies had kept in place. His superiors were furious. He hadn't fully cleared it with the American military governor overseeing his zone. Economists at the time predicted chaos, hoarding, panic buying, total collapse of what little order remained. What actually happened was the opposite. Shopkeepers who had been sitting on hidden inventory for years, waiting for prices to reflect actual value, pulled that inventory out of their back rooms and cellars almost immediately. Because the new currency was stable and prices were finally allowed to reflect real supply and demand, sellers trusted that they'd be paid something meaningful for their goods. Within days, shop windows that had been empty for years were full. Within a year, industrial output and food production had both climbed dramatically. By 1950, the British press had started calling it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, and the name stuck. It's worth being precise about what actually drove that miracle, because the popular version overstates any single cause. The currency reform mattered enormously, restoring basic trust in money itself. The Marshall Plan, American financial aid aimed at rebuilding Western Europe, provided real capital for rebuilding factories and infrastructure, though economic historians still debate exactly how large its specific contribution was relative to the currency reform. And Erhard's broader economic approach, a philosophy called ordoliberalism, or the social market economy, combined free market competition with a real social safety net, giving West Germans both the incentive to work and the security to not fear total collapse if they failed. By 1960, West Germany's economy had been transformed almost beyond recognition from the moonscape of 1945. By 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, it was the third largest economy on the planet, trailing only the United States and Japan. A country that had been written off as finished permanently by serious economists just 4 decades earlier was now one of the wealthiest nations in human history. Think about the speed of that transformation for a moment, because it's easy to type out the timeline and lose the actual scale of what happened. A person born in Dresden in 1945, into a city that had been almost entirely flattened by Allied bombing just months earlier, could, by the time they turned 15, be living in a country widely described as an economic miracle. By the time that same person turned 44, they'd be living in one of the 3 richest nations on the planet. That is the kind of reversal that shouldn't be possible, according to almost any historical precedent for what happens to a defeated, occupied, physically devastated nation. And yet it happened, largely within a single human generation, which is exactly why the word miracle stuck. Even though economists will tell you it wasn't magic, it was a specific, identifiable set of policy choices executed at a moment when the alternative, continued stagnation under price controls, had already visibly failed for 3 straight years. That's rebuild number 1. Total devastation, followed by a currency reform gamble almost nobody believed would work, followed by roughly 4 decades of being the envy of the world. Here's where the story gets more interesting, because most people assume Germany's next major crisis came from outside. It didn't. It came from inside, from the country's own reunification, and it very nearly undid everything the Wirtschaftswunder had built. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and East and West Germany reunified in 1990, the popular narrative was pure triumph, a divided nation made whole again. The economic reality underneath that triumph was brutal. East Germany's economy, decades behind the West under Soviet-style central planning, had to be absorbed into a unified system essentially overnight. East German workers were given West German wages under a unified labor market, but East German productivity hadn't remotely caught up to justify those wages. The result was a wave of unemployment that hit the former East especially hard, and a fiscal burden on the unified German state that ran into the trillions over the following decades. The consequences took a few years to fully show up, but when they did, they were severe. German unemployment climbed from under 4% in the 1970s to nearly 9% between 1995 and 2005. By other measures, it rose from 7.8% in 2000 to 11.1% by 2005, nearly 5 million people out of work at the peak, the highest jobless total in the country's post-war history. GDP growth, which had once made Germany the engine of Europe, slowed to an average of roughly 1.2% a year through the early 2000s, including outright contractions of 0.2% in 2002 and 0.7% in 2003. In 1999, The Economist magazine gave Germany a new nickname, one that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, the sick man of Europe. The conventional story of how Germany recovered from this second collapse credits a specific set of policies, the Hartz reforms, a package of labor market changes implemented between 2003 and 2005 under Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. They tightened unemployment benefits, deregulated temporary work agencies, merged unemployment and welfare assistance into a single system, and generally pushed toward a work-first philosophy. And on the surface, the timeline looks like a clean success story. Unemployment fell steadily from a peak of almost 11% in 2005 to just 5% by the end of 2014, the lowest level since reunification. But here's the detail that most retellings leave out, and it matters if you actually want to understand how Germany rebuilds itself instead of just repeating a comfortable myth. Multiple rigorous economic studies, including research published through the Center for Economic Policy Research, argue the Hartz reforms were not actually the primary driver of that recovery. Their case is this: German. Trade unions had already been practicing significant wage restraint since the mid-1990s, years before Hartz existed, specifically because reunification had opened up cheap labor markets in Central and Eastern Europe, and German companies now had a credible threat of moving production there if domestic wages stayed too high. That threat, not the Hartz legislation, is what economists in this camp argue actually forced the wage concessions that restored German competitiveness. The Hartz reforms happened to arrive around the same time as this shift, and got credit for a recovery that was already substantially underway. Germany's own construction sector, badly oversized during the post-reunification building boom, had also finished shrinking back down to a sustainable size right around the same period, removing a major drag on GDP growth independent of any labor policy at all. Why does this matter for understanding today's crisis? Because it means Germany's second recovery wasn't really a triumph of clever policy design the way the currency reform of 1948 was. It was, in large part, market pressure and painful wage stagnation working slowly and unglamorously in the background, with a well-timed piece of legislation absorbing most of the credit. That distinction between what actually works and what simply gets the credit is exactly the question hanging over Germany's third crisis right now. There's a second detail worth pulling out of this period, because it directly foreshadows the crisis we're about to get into. Reunification's fiscal cost wasn't a one-time bill that got paid off and forgotten. Decades later, the economic gap between the former East and West still hadn't fully closed, and a 2023 survey conducted more than 30 years after reunification found a persistent, measurable divide in wages, wealth, and economic sentiment between the two halves of the country. That unresolved gap didn't just sit quietly in the background. It became, decades later, one of the most fertile sources of political resentment that a new far-right party would eventually learn to harvest, In other words, the second collapse didn't just get solved by wage restraint and labor reform. Part of its damage simply went underground, waiting. Which brings us to today, and to a crisis that a growing number of German economists are describing not as a normal recession, but as something structurally different, deindustrialization. And the distinction matters enormously. A recession is cyclical. The economy contracts, then it recovers, the way it always has. Deindustrialization is not cyclical. When a factory closes and the machines get dismantled and the skilled workers scatter to other industries or other countries, that capacity doesn't just switch back on when conditions improve. It's largely gone. The numbers here are not subtle. Germany is on track for 4 recessions in 4 years by the end of 2026, an outcome the European Central Bank itself has explicitly warned about, describing it as having no post-war precedent. Industrial production sits roughly 15% below its 2017 peak. German car production, long the flagship of the entire economy, has fallen from 5.65 million vehicles in 2017 to a forecast of just 4.1 million in 2026, meaning the industry is now producing at roughly 2/3 of its 2018 level. And this isn't abstract macroeconomic data. It's showing up as specific, named companies making specific, brutal decisions. Volkswagen is cutting 35,000 jobs and closing plants in Germany for the first time in the company's history. Bosch is eliminating 22,000 positions. ThyssenKrupp, once synonymous with German steel, is cutting 11,000 jobs from that division alone. BASF, one of the largest chemical companies on Earth, opened an 8.7 billion euro plant in Zhanjiang, China in 2026, while simultaneously cutting around 2,800 jobs at its original home base in Ludwigshafen. Surveyed industrial firms are voting with their feet at scale. 42% say they plan to invest abroad rather than at home. And among the country's largest family-owned businesses, the backbone of the traditional German economic model, more than 40% are actively considering moving some or all of their operations out of the country entirely, with the United States, Poland, India, and China as the preferred destinations. The root cause, according to essentially every economic institution studying this, traces back to a single structural shock: the loss of cheap Russian energy following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. German industry, and in particular its energy-intensive base materials sector, chemicals, steel, industrial manufacturing, was built for decades on the assumption of reliable, inexpensive gas. That assumption is gone, and energy-intensive production has fallen more than 15% since early 2022, nearly double the decline across German industry as a whole. Layer on top of that new Chinese competition in electric vehicles, a sector Germany was slow to pivot toward, and fresh American tariff pressure on European auto exports, and you get a compounding set of pressures, none of which resembles a normal cyclical downturn. There's genuine disagreement, even among German economists, about how bad to call this. The president of the respected IFO Institute has publicly pushed back against apocalyptic sick man framing, describing what's happening as more of a retreat and reinvention of manufacturing than a wholesale collapse, and arguing the substance of German industry is still there. It simply has to reinvent itself around a different energy and competitive reality. Other institutions, like the DIW Research Institute, take the opposite view, warning that a combination of continued recession and deindustrialization is increasingly plausible, with more short-time work schemes, layoffs, closures, and business insolvency still to come. That live disagreement between this is manageable if uncomfortable, and this is genuinely different from anything before, is itself part of the story. Unlike 1948, when the diagnosis and the fix were both relatively clear once tried, and unlike the 2000s, when the eventual recovery was at least visible in hindsight, right now nobody, not the IFO Institute, not the DIW, not the German government itself, actually agrees on which version of this crisis is the true one. Here's what makes this third crisis genuinely different from the two that came before it. And it isn't just the economics, it's the politics happening at the exact same time. In February 2025, Germany held a snap federal election, triggered by the collapse of the governing coalition after years of internal fighting over economic policy, energy reform, and immigration. The result reshaped German politics in a way that hadn't happened since reunification. The center-right won, but the far-right alternative for Deutschland finished second, with 20.8% of the national vote and 152 seats in the Bundestag, its strongest result since the party's founding, and the strongest showing by a far-right party in German federal politics since the Second World War. Parts of the AfD have been formally classified as extremist by Germany's own domestic intelligence services, though the party's full federal designation is still being reviewed by the Constitutional Court. Voter turnout hit 83.5%, the highest since reunification, a sign not of stability, but of exactly how anxious the electorate had become. Compare that to the two previous crises. In 1948, occupied Germany didn't have a functioning independent democracy, yet to fracture, the currency reform was implemented essentially by administrative fiat under Allied oversight. In the early 2000s, even at the depth of the sick man of Europe years, Germany's mainstream political coalition held together well enough to pass the Hartz reforms and see them through. However contested their actual impact turned out to be, this time is different. The economic crisis and the political fragmentation are happening simultaneously and are actively feeding each other, with economic anxiety fueling the AfD's rise and a fractured coalition-dependent government finding it far harder to push through the kind of decisive structural response that saved Germany the previous two times. Look at how the government itself came to exist as evidence of just how thin that political margin has become. The 2025 election was triggered by the collapse of Germany's previous three-party coalition after Chancellor Olaf Scholz dismissed his finance minister over disagreements about economic policy, energy reform, and government spending, a dismissal that broke the coalition apart entirely and forced a snap election months ahead of schedule. The government that eventually emerged from that election, led by Friedrich Merz, only holds together as what's sometimes called a grand alliance, a coalition built less on shared vision than on the fact that every other viable combination of parties was worse. Meanwhile, the AfD's growth hasn't been a slow, steady climb. It roughly doubled its support between 2021 and 2025, gaining a full quarter of the electorate when combined with a smaller populist left party, in a country where a quarter of voters backing parties considered regressive by the political mainstream. Would have been almost unthinkable a decade earlier. That's not the political backdrop of a country calmly implementing a rescue plan. It's the backdrop of a country trying to implement a rescue plan while simultaneously arguing with itself about who gets to be at the table. Germany's current government isn't standing still. In early 2026, the country's constitutional debt brake, a strict fiscal rule that had limited government borrowing for over a decade, was modified specifically to allow a €500 billion special fund, the largest single spending authorization in the country's post-war history. The money is earmarked for defense and infrastructure, rail, roads, energy grid modernization, and military spending above 1% of GDP has been explicitly exempted from the old debt limits entirely. It's a bet that looks structurally similar to the moves that worked in 1948 and, less directly, in the 2000s. A bold, historically unprecedented policy shift made under real pressure, betting that decisive government action can reset the trajectory of the entire economy. But there's an honest reason to be uncertain this time in a way that wasn't quite true before. The 1948 currency reform fixed a monetary problem with a monetary solution, and it worked almost immediately because the underlying industrial base, damaged as it was, still physically existed and just needed capital and incentive to restart. The wage restraint of the 1990s and 2000s fixed a competitiveness problem by lowering costs gradually over roughly a decade. Germany's current crisis is different in kind. It's an energy cost and structural competitiveness problem, and €500 billion of infrastructure spending, however large, doesn't directly lower the price of natural gas or make German chemical plants competitive again with facilities built in places where energy is simply cheaper. The European Central Bank has flagged this risk explicitly. If the fiscal stimulus lands in a higher interest rate environment, its impact on debt-financed investment gets partially canceled out before it even has a chance to work. There's also a timing problem that didn't exist in either of the first two rebuilds. The currency reform of 1948 delivered visible results within days. The wage restraint that quietly fixed the 2000s crisis took the better part of a decade. But at least the direction of travel was consistently downward on unemployment almost the entire time, giving the public and the political system tangible proof the strategy was working even before anyone agreed on why. The €500 billion fund, by contrast, is explicitly a long horizon. Infrastructure and defense investment, the kind of spending that reshapes an economy's foundations over 5, 10, 15 years, not months. That creates a dangerous gap. A government trying to hold together a fragile coalition, facing a resurgent far-right party feeding on economic anxiety, asking the public to be patient for a decade-long payoff at the exact moment patience is in shortest supply. Germany has never had to execute a rebuild on a slow fuse, while its own domestic politics were burning on a fast one. That combination, not the raw economic numbers alone, is what makes serious economists genuinely uncertain about the outcome this time, rather than simply pessimistic or simply confident. Here's the honest answer, the one that doesn't fit neatly into either Germany always finds a way or Germany is finished, because both of those framings flatten a genuinely complicated situation. Germany's first rebuild proved that a country can recover from near total physical destruction faster than almost anyone. Predicted, if it gets the fundamentals right, stable currency, functioning price signals, and enough external support to bridge the gap. Germany's second rebuild proved something quieter, but just as important, that a country can absorb an enormous self-inflicted fiscal shock and grind its way back to competitiveness, even if the popular story of how it did so gives credit to the wrong policy. Both of those rebuilds happened, crucially, with a relatively united political system behind them, willing to bear real short-term pain for a long-term fix. The third crisis is testing something neither of the first two ever had to test: whether Germany can execute a similarly decisive economic reset while its own political center is fracturing in real time. With a fifth of the electorate backing a party the political mainstream refuses to work with, and with a structural energy problem that doesn't respond to the same tools that worked before. The €500 billion fund is a genuinely historic bet. Whether it's enough is a question nobody, including the German government making that bet, actually knows the answer to yet. It's worth asking the question the other way too, since every prior comparison in this video has looked backward. What would it actually look like if this third rebuild failed in a way the first two never quite did? It wouldn't look like 1945, with visible rubble and starvation, and it wouldn't look like a single dramatic headline. It would look exactly like what economists mean when they use the word deindustrialization instead of recession. A slow, steady hollowing out, where the factories that close don't reopen, the skilled workers who leave don't come back, and the country settles into a smaller, less influential version of itself over 10 or 15 years, rather than collapsing in any single visible moment. That's precisely why comparisons to the American Rust Belt in northern England keep coming up in serious economic analysis of Germany right now. Those are both regions that deindustrialized and never fully recovered decades later. Germany, for the first time in its post-war history, has to seriously reckon with the possibility that this crisis doesn't have a clean miracle ending at all, that the honest range of outcomes now includes a version of the future where the country simply becomes smaller and less central to the global economy than it's been for the last 70 years. What we do know is this: Germany has been counted out twice before, in 1945 and again in the mid-1990s, and both times the country. Everyone had written off, quietly rebuilt itself into an economic power the rest of the world had to reckon with. That history doesn't guarantee a third comeback. But it does mean anyone confidently predicting Germany's permanent decline right now is making a bet against a country with a genuinely unmatched track record of proving that bet wrong. It also means anyone confidently assuming the miracle always happens again is ignoring exactly how different the tools available this time actually are, and exactly how much less political room the country now has to use them. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of how Germany actually rebuilds itself, subscribe to EndGame Analysis, because we're going to keep tracking whether this third recovery attempt actually works. Tell me in the comments, do you think the €500 billion fund is enough? Or is Germany's current crisis fundamentally different from the two it already survived? I read every comment, and they shape what we cover next. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.